I think the events of 2011 have given us a pretty good and pretty scary insight into what we can expect in 2012. And basically, what we should expect is the expansion of the tyranny of middle-class miserabilism. I think we should expect the expansion and indeed the fortification of the dominant ideology of our times, which is basically the ideology of middle-class moaning, a mishmash of thriftiness, low horizons, naturalism, killjoyism, and illiberalism. That outlook has become increasingly influential in 2011 and will become even more so in 2012. It's been clear for a while, perhaps for as long as 10 or 15 years, that the middle classes are on the march and are starting to seize power across society. Everywhere you look these days, in the media and in politics, middle-class values are clearly in the ascendant, and older ruling class and working class values are on the wane and are increasingly being demonised. Indeed, it's no accident that the two great hate figures of our time are toffs and chavs, Jacob Rees-Mogg and Vicky Pollard, because both of those kinds of people are seen as an affront to the new system of middle-class, mean-spirited middle-class morality. And middle-class miserabilism is becoming embedded in every area of life. You can see it in the entrenchment of the politics of environmentalism, basically the mean-spirited idea that protecting the air in parks in Hampstead should trump industrial growth in China and Asia, elsewhere in Asia. You can see it in the miserly demonisation of greed and aspiration, where we're increasingly told that even the desire for more wealth and more stuff is now actually a mental illness called affluenza. You can see it in the way that a certain brand of stony-faced feminism has seeped into mainstream thinking, almost unnoticed, to such an extent that over the past fortnight alone, 2 adverts were banned by the Advertising Standards Authority, one for Lynx and one for Marks and Spencer's, because they were considered offensive to women. No one bats an eyelid, no one complains. It's the return of the Merry White House outlook, but dressed up in a kind of middle-class miserabilist language. And you can see the rise of middle-class miserabilism in the way that even the Occupy movement, made up of the most deracinated sections of the petty bourgeoisie, is fawned over by everyone, from Barack Obama to Ed Miliband. And every serious journalist also feels the need to bow and scrape before this infinitesimally small group of middle-class moaners. And if you visit the Occupy camp outside St. Paul's Cathedral, what you realise is that it's basically just a litany of middle-class miserabilist arguments. Arguments against economic growth, arguments against the idiots who make up the rat race trudging to work every morning past St. Paul's Cathedral. Don't these stupid people know that there are better things to do than work 9 to 5? Arguments against bankers for being evil and rich, and against consumers for being stupid and for wanting to be rich. The ease with which the Occupy movement can flip between attacking the rich and attacking ordinary consumers really reveals that kind of middle-class miserabilist heart to their arguments. Basically, they're against the idea of wealth in general. Basically, they're against the upper classes and the lower classes, the Jacob Rees-Moggs and the Vicky Pollards. And you can see the rise of middle-class miserabilism in the way that fox hunting was eliminated 10 years ago and the way that the News of the World was eliminated this year. They announced their arrival by doing away with a sporting institution of the upper classes, and they've upped their ante by destroying a media institution of the working classes. They're nothing if not ambitious. Hundreds of families may have enjoyed fox hunting, 7 million people every Sunday may have read the News of the World, but that doesn't matter. These 2 institutions were offensive to the increasingly influential middle-class miserabilists, and therefore they had to be destroyed. It's worth asking who is safe in that kind of climate, when things as old and established and as unpopular as fox hunting and the News of the World can be done away with, and no one even really sheds a tear for them. I think it's important to ask ourselves why there is this rise of the middle class, and particularly of a certain miserabilist form of middle-class activist. You know, if you read the Telegraph or the Mail, you could be forgiven for thinking that there is a conspiracy of Guardianistas who all meet in some cafe in Hampstead and plot to ruin our fun and spoil our lives and make life miserable for the rest of us, which is obviously a fantasy. Middle-class miserablism is in the ascendancy by default, not by design. It is predicated on the collapse of the two great classes of old, the capitalist class and the working class. Broadly speaking, the right and the left. It is the historic immolation of those two classes over the past 2 decades which has set the stage for the emergence of that third, traditionally ignored, ever so slightly annoying class, the middle class. It's the emptying out of the old historic clash between the capitalist class and the working class, which defined politics for the past 200 years, which creates the space for the emergence of this third class and explains why it has become so extraordinarily influential in politics, media, and society over the past 10 to 15 years. So if you look at the capitalist class, for example, they are a shadow of their former selves. They're a laughingstock, even to a Marxist like me. If you read the Communist Manifesto by Marx and Engels, they heap praise upon the original capitalist class, on the radical bourgeoisie who wanted to remake society. They heap praise upon them for what they built, for what they did, for their transformation of the globe. They wouldn't recognise the capitalist class we have today, which is completely risk-averse, meek, doesn't even really believe in the free market anymore, certainly doesn't believe in massive manufacturing or building new infrastructure, but is simply this kind of meek capitalist class which is influenced in many ways by the ideas of the Occupy movement itself. Just look at something like the Tory party, which wants the kind of embodiment of that old upper ruling class. Today, the most hilarious criticism that people make of the Tory party is to say that Cameron's new Conservatives are really just Thatcher in disguise. They are the old free marketeers just pretending to be nice and touchy-feely and everything else. That is complete nonsense. The contemporary Tory party has nothing in common with Thatcher at all. It's basically just New Labour on steroids. It's resurrected, it keeps up New Labour's nannying, except it calls it nudging instead. It keeps up New Labour's interference in everyday families. We saw that today with the launch of that bizarre campaign to correct 120,000 so-called problem families. It's obsessed with lifestyle, telling us what to eat. If you look at something like Ian Duncan Smith's increasingly creepy poverty institution, it's all about measuring the sizes of working class people's brains, trying to work out why they're such bad parents, trying to prevent children from being walked forever before the age of 3. Basically, we have the return of New Labour values dressed up as a Conservative party, but it's not a Conservative party at all. The lack of a moral anchor, the lack of any political depth to the modern Tory party means that even that old establishment institution has been quite easily invaded by the values of the middle-class miserabilists. And then if we look at the working-class institutions of old, trade unions are a joke. The left has completely abandoned any commitment to growth in favour of calling for everyone to rein in and tighten their belts and save the planet, and so on. And the working classes only feature in public debate now as either a threat to the social order or as victims, as either violent chavs or beaten women who need the help of the middle-class miserabilist industry to put them on the straight and narrow. So it is the hollowing out of those traditional, the two classes around which politics was based for 200 or more years. It's the hollowing out of those classes which has allowed the rise of this rather intemperate, illiberal, middle-class, miserabilist section of society. And I think we are going to see them become ever more influential next year unless we decide to do something about it. The thing to bear in mind about the rise of these middle-class miserabilists is that their outlook on life, their political creed, doesn't have any real roots in tradition, as the old conservative outlook used to have, and it doesn't have any real roots in ordinary people's lives, as the old politics of the working classes had. It's a very fleeting, flimsy, weak outlook, which is only strong now because of the weakness of alternatives and because of the weakness of the old idea that we should grow society and create a better world and make more stuff, not less. So I think in 2012, one thing worth thinking about is having a union of toffs and chavs, a union of the old upper classes who are still committed to conservative values and are still interested in growth, with working class people who still want to have better, more fulfilling, more stuff-filled lives. If we can bring those two sections of society together, then we might have a chance of doing away with the middle-class miserabilists who have been dominating our lives for the past 10 years. If you want to see what a mess both politics and language are in at the moment, you just have to consider the fact that last week Downing Street issued a statement saying it was okay to use the phrase pregnant women. So this is the seat of political power in Britain, informing the populace that it is acceptable to say that women get pregnant. It is acceptable to say that pregnancy is something that happens to a woman, not to a man. And basically, Downing Street is saying it's okay for you to express and give voice to biological facts, which the vast majority of people around the country will have thought was a very strange thing for Downing Street to have to remind us of. Now, of course, this was in response to a controversy involving the Foreign Office. The Foreign Office had to give advice to the United Nations on the wording of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and that covenant contains a line which says pregnant women should not be given the death penalty. And the Foreign Office said, we have a bit of a problem with the phrase pregnant women, because it might be offensive to, I don't know, the 17 people who have given birth while claiming or identifying as men. And so it said to the UN, please say pregnant people to avoid giving offence. And it caused such a stink that eventually Downing Street had to come out and say, look, it's okay to say pregnant women. This is an incredibly bizarre situation that we have to try and get our heads around. Firstly, the fact that the Foreign Office has gone, even the Foreign Office, even the kind of stuffy Foreign Office which extends Britain's influence around the world, full of suits and civil servants and probably quite boring people, even the Foreign Office has gone down the rabbit hole of postmodernist trans speech, where even the words men and women are being called into question. And the second bizarre thing, of course, is that Downing Street has to tell us, has to give us a green light that it's okay to say pregnant women, a phrase that people use every single day, and that's how they understand the world they live in. And I think what that story really points to is that we face something really worrying today, a crisis of political language that is actually quite profound and disturbing. A crisis of political language that I think expresses a crisis of politics more broadly, and beyond that, a crisis of meaning, a collapse of meaning, a collapse of the basic categories through which people have traditionally understood politics, the world, and their place in the world. A collapse of the ideas and substance and meaning of everyday life, in essence. So I think the unanchoring of political language, the confusions of political language today, both express and intensify a crisis of public life and even a crisis of common sense. So we actually face something more than what Orwell wrote about in his famous essay, which is not just the misuse of political language, not just the use of political language to mystify rather than clarify and to disguise rather than enlighten. We still have that, of course. We still have the propagandistic misuse of language. But we have something else too, something even worse, a situation where political language has become disconnected from reality and has increasingly become this very crude tool for the expression of narrow, contradictory, mystifying, and even unhinged ideas. So I just want to look at three ways in which I think political language is in crisis today. The first is that thing Orwell and others wrote about, that ongoing, often quite conscious, and sometimes quite sinister misuse of political language to, in Orwell's words, make murder look respectable. We still got that. We still have that. We still have people who very consciously misuse language to hide what they're really doing or to hide what they really think. So this is an era in which peacekeeping,
is presented to us as something that the United Nations does, something that the British military does, when we know that what they're really doing is war. War is increasingly presented to us as peacekeeping. The United Nations will intervene in a foreign, normally already war-ravaged country. It will often support one side, demonize another. It might even get involved in arming certain groups. It might get involved in raping women, as has happened in certain places where the UN has posted troops. It will inevitably end up entrenching the divisions in that country, intensifying the conflict, deepening the bloodshed, and it calls it a peacekeeping operation. War is now peace. All peace is war. This is an era in which Western governments, the British government and the American government, will bomb other countries and refer to it as humanitarian intervention. That shockingly Orwellian political phrase that was invented by the likes of Tony Blair and much of the Labour Party of the time, which supported him, and also the liberal press, which presented the bombing of Yugoslavia in particular in 1999 as humanitarian intervention. They used the language of caring, saving, humanitarianism, protection, while they were killing hundreds of people, including hundreds of refugees. On more than one occasion, they bombed columns of refugees who were fleeing Yugoslavia and killed them. Women, pregnant women, children, all blown to bits, all of it referred to as humanitarian intervention. A deeply sinister misuse of language. Barbarism disguised as humanitarianism, destruction disguised as construction, as rescue. And then on the domestic front, I think one of the misuses of political language that I find most intriguing and concerning is around the word incapacity, particularly in relation, of course, to incapacity benefit, which is a thing that was introduced in the 1970s, really took off in the 1980s. It's in that decade where the number of people receiving incapacity benefit goes up exponentially and eventually reaches around 1 million. And then in more recent times, incapacity has been reimagined as disability or incapability, and other words get attached to this idea. But that's also incredibly deceitful language. That is the presentation of societal failure, in this instance, the society's failure to provide people with gainful employment, the presentation of societal failure as individual incapacity. The presentation of the limitations of capitalist society and its inability to provide everyone with work as a failing on the part of the individual. It's his or her incapacity that is the problem. And of course, if you look at the 1980s, what happens, hundreds of thousands of people are thrown out of work, particularly in the areas of manufacturing and mining and other traditional forms of industry, and they're redefined as incapable. And they come to think of themselves tragically and inevitably as incapable. And so what we have in those instances, and there are numerous other instances, is the misuse of language, the very sinister misuse of language to disguise what's really going on politically and to cover up war, destruction, unemployment, and other deeply problematic things that happen in modern society. The second way in which political language is in crisis is the way in which some political terms and phrases and descriptions have become so emptied of substance that they now mean the opposite of what they once meant. And there are a few examples of this that I want to give. The first is the word progressive. Whenever I hear someone describe themselves as progressive now, I know that they are not progressive. It's the easiest way to work out if someone's progressive. You can see this all the time. Almost everyone who describes themselves as progressive is actually opposed to progress, is actually largely very uncomfortable with the ideas of the Enlightenment and with the ideas of a future-orientated humanist desire to expand man's influence over nature, to develop the forces of production, to move forward and progress. Even environmentalists call themselves progressive, and you just know they're taking the mick. I've heard people say, we are progressives opposed to fracking. And you just want to shake them by their collars and say, that means you're not progressive. You are opposing a progressive step, a new form of industry, something that could give people employment and create more energy. That's not progressive. The other word that has utterly changed meaning is anti-racist. To be anti-racist now is to be hyper-conscious about race. To be anti-racist now is to think racially all the time. It is to say to people, you're white, you're black, you're this, you're that. It is to behave in the way racist people used to behave, although it's done in a very politically correct way. To be anti-racist now is to go and see a movie in the cinema and count the number of black faces, and then write a Tumblr post later about how terrible it is that Hollywood won't employ enough black people. It is to be myopically racial, obsessively racial. That to me is the opposite of what anti-racist used to mean, which was to get rid of the whole nonsense idea of race. Free speech now means the opposite of what it used to mean. Free speech used to mean you wanted free speech. Now, very often, people will argue for censorship under the guise of freedom of speech. One example of that is Yvette Cooper, who is pushing this thing called Reclaim the Internet, which wants new rules and regulations on the internet so people can't say certain things. And she says this is not about limiting free speech, this is about expanding it. Because if we allow trolls to speak online, other people feel that they can't speak. So in calling for the regulation of speech, she says she is defending freedom of speech. Utterly Orwellian. Censorship is freedom. The other two words that now are emptied of meaning is conservative and Labour. The Conservative Party is no longer interested in conserving things, and the Labour Party no longer knows anyone who labours for a living. The Conservative Party, if you just look at their Gender Identity Act, which would allow anyone to claim to be any gender regardless of reality, looks to me like a complete and utter embrace of postmodernism, a destruction of tradition at its very core. That is the end of any suggestion that the Conservative Party is the Conservative Party. Labour increasingly looks to me like a movement against ordinary people rather than for ordinary people. A movement that wants to police and control what people see and eat and how often they can gamble, and which sees them as a problem to be solved rather than a people to be represented. The left increasingly means being against ordinary people rather than for them, and the Brexit debate proves that too. And then the third and final way in which political language is corroded today is, I think, the most important, which is that political language has increasingly surrendered to the culture wars. Political language is increasingly a tool of identity and validation rather than of description and the expression of convictions. And it's really interesting, I think, that the two of the most common political terms today that are used to describe people are very rarely used by people themselves to describe themselves. And those two phrases are politically correct and neoliberal. I find it fascinating that we see those phrases bandied around all the time. You're politically correct, you're a neoliberal. But it's incredibly, incredibly rare that anyone describes themselves as politically correct or anyone describes themselves as neoliberal. Because that is political language that is not used to describe something accurately, it's used to brand, it's used to other people. It's used in the culture wars, in the identity wars to say, I'm good, you're evil. It's a marker rather than a tool of description. And you see that again and again today, particularly in the misuse of terms like fascist and communist. So people on the left will call anyone who even remotely disagrees with Angela Merkel's welcoming of 800,000 migrants into Germany, you're a fascist if you have any issue with that whatsoever. You're instantly a fascist. They're like Rick from The Young Ones. Everyone is a fascist. And then on the right, anyone who likes the NHS and wants to expand it and thinks certain things should be done by the government rather than by the free market is a Marxist, a communist, a firebrand. They keep saying this about Corbynistas, and of course it's not true. As someone recently said, Corbynism is basically just microwaved Milibandism. It's not Marxism. That's the key problem, I think, with political language right now, which is that it is increasingly used within the culture wars not to accurately describe yourself or to accurately describe your enemies, but simply to puff up yourself and demonize others. And that gives rise to a situation where it can be very difficult to work out the truth of politics and the truth of where people stand. The one word that is most demonized, and which I think we should reclaim, is the word populist. That's the word that is the most demonic word today. Everyone who opposes the European Union, a deeply authoritarian, bureaucratic, backward institution, is branded a populist. And in relation to that, I say bring it on. Populist means being interested in and wanting to engage with the popular will. And I think the more that we can reorient politics around doing that, the more we can move away from the dishonest, destructive, self-interested misuse of political language. Thank you.